evening, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to be presenting in Scott Momaday this evening. My name's Amanda Sutton. I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your longtime independent bookstore in the Rio Grande River Valley of Albuquerque. If you've never visited our shop, we have been a neighborhood staple for 36 years. We're next door to the Flying Star, and we're in a shopping center with all local businesses. This weekend, as you probably know, we had Black Friday and Small Business Saturday as we start to launch into the holiday shopping season. This season, of course, is different than all others because of the pandemic, but I wanted to let you know that we're still around, we're still selling books, and we are pleased to be taking your orders. So thank you so much for supporting us. We've had a booming weekend at bookworks.com, thousands of dollars of orders rolling in there, so thank you. Our website is our name, Bookworks, without the O's. So it's bkwrks.com, all consonants. I will put the link into the chat for our website. We are offering free shipping the holiday season with a $40 purchase. The coupon code for that is FREESHIP40. You can find all that information on our homepage. So I will put the link to our website in the chat. Feel free to chat with other attendees if you would like during the event. You can also type any of your questions into the Q&A. We will do a question and answer with Scott at the end of our event. So we are here tonight to talk about Earthkeeper, the latest from the prolific in Scott Momaday. We will be playing some audio for you from the book. I have the audio version of the book, which Scott reads himself. It's absolutely wonderful. We're going to play a few things from that. We're going to talk a little bit about the ideas in the book and hopefully a lot about Scott's life, since this book is a spiritual autobiography. I'm curious to know more about that as well. So the Earthkeeper, it's just out from HarperCollins this fall. Scott also published a book, The Death of Sitting Bear with them, earlier during the pandemic. You can pick that up. That's poetry. Thank you all again so much for being here with us today. I'm super excited about this event. As a native Oklahoman, I grew up reading in Scott Momaday's literature, The Housemaid of Dawn and The Way to Rainy Mountain. As you probably know, Scott is a prolific and world-renowned poet, novelist, playwright, teacher, scholar, doctor, and a painter. He's also the winner of a Pulitzer Prize. I'm not sure I've hosted another Pulitzer Prize winner. This might be my first one. He won the Pulitzer for Housemaid of Dawn. He also won the National Medal of Arts, I believe, under the second Bush administration. He has been the Oklahoma Poet Laureate in recent years, and currently he's the founder and chairman of Buffalo Trust. This new book is marvelous. It takes you on a journey from his early days and his family life in Oklahoma out to the beloved Southwest, where he grew up on the Navajo reservation, spent much of his life in the wondrous Jemez Valley, and now comes to us from Santa Fe. Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm thrilled to be here with you, albeit virtually. I wish we were at the Chemo Theater or someplace with some pizzazz.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, Amanda. Pleasure.
I really appreciate your joining us. Okay, we're going to start out by hearing a little bit about the book in Scott's own words. So I'm going to try to do this screen share. Hopefully this will go along swimmingly. All right, folks, this is the audio version from HarperCollins with N. Scott Momaday reading. You can also find this on our website for the event page.
To the remembered earth.
Once in his life, a man ought to concentrate his mind upon the remembered earth, I believe. He ought to give himself up to a particular landscape in his experience, to look at it from as many angles as he can, to wonder about it, to dwell upon it. He ought to imagine that he touches it with his hands at every season, and listens to the sounds that are made upon it. He ought to imagine the creatures there, and all the faintest motions of the wind. He ought to recollect the glare of noon, and all the colors of the dawn and dusk. From the Way to Rainy Mountain. Author's note. The reflections contained herein stem from a deep investment in the American landscape. I was born and grew up in the American West. It is a part of the earth that I have come to know well and love deeply. I have been fortunate enough to have traveled over much of the world, and I've experienced many things, met many interesting people, beheld many wonders. I have written about them, but here I've written about what I know best, my native ground. This book is a very personal account, a kind of spiritual autobiography. When I think about my life and the lives of my ancestors, I am inevitably led to the conviction that I and they belong to the American land. This is a declaration of belonging, and it is an offering to the earth.
Just gorgeous work. Absolutely gorgeous. Can you tell us a little bit more about that sense of belonging that comes through your work and how you found belonging in the landscapes that you've lived upon here in the West?
Yes. The sense of belonging, I think, stems from the fact that I am descended from many, many generations of Native Americans. We believe that, the Kiowas we know were at one time in the northern part of what is now the United States. The earliest evidence we have of them places them near the headwaters of the Yellowstone River. But before that, I'm pretty sure that they migrated across the Bering Bridge from Central Asia, Siberia. So they've been here for thousands of years. And I think in that tenure, they have acquired a sense of belonging to the land. And I certainly consider that I belong to the land as well.
Can you talk a little bit about your life in the Southwest? You were born in Oklahoma in Lawton there at Fort Sill, very close to the Wichita Mountains, which is just an absolutely gorgeous landscape in and of itself. Really old, rundown mountains, different mountains than we think about here in New Mexico, perhaps. Can you tell us a little bit about what brought your family to the Southwest?
I was born during the Depression, and my parents were looking for work. And at the time, we were living at the homestead in Oklahoma, which my grandfather built in 1913. And they found work on the Navajo reservation. So at a very tender age, I was still an infant, really. We moved to New Mexico, to Shiprock, and that's where my parents found work. And later, we lived at Tuba City and Chinle on the Navajo reservation. And so I had a sense of that landscape when I was very small, and I heard Navajo spoken. And I have an ear for it because I heard it at such an impressionable age. So I can say words in Navajo that some people have a hard time saying. And I did study Navajo for a summer intensively. So I am somewhat familiar with the language. And I've lived on two of the Apache reservations, the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona and the Hickory Apache Reservation in New Mexico. But for the longest period, I lived at the Pueblo of Jemez, where my parents were the teachers at the two-teacher day school there. And I was there from the age of 12 until about 17. So these were very impressionable years, and I loved living there. I had a wonderful time growing up there. Got to know the land pretty well by riding through it on horseback. I had a horse, and I spent a lot of time on the back of that horse. Came to know the landscape quite well. And since then, I have traveled over the world and seen many interesting things, as I say. But my investment in the landscape of the Southwest is very deep.
And what of the investment in language? I know both of your parents were educators, and of course, you've gone on to be a long time influential educator yourself. How did your parents inspire a early love of literature with you?
Well, my father was a full-blood Kiowa, and he grew up listening to the stories in the oral tradition of the tribe. So he passed them on to me. He told me stories from the time I could first understand language. And I loved them so much, I had him tell them to me again and again and again, and they got embedded in my mind. And then at a later time, after I had become an adult, I transcribed some of these from the oral tradition into print. And that book, The Way to Rainy Mountain, which is published by the University of New Mexico Press, is a catalog of tales from the Kiowa oral tradition. There it is. Yeah. So I've been interested in language for a long time. I know English pretty well. But it's the only language that I know pretty well. I've had lots of inklings of other languages. I've lived in France and Germany and the Soviet Union, and I've picked up those languages, in a rudimentary way, so I can say, "Where's the restaurant?" or things like that. But English is the language I know best, and the one that I've written in. And so I like language in the abstract. I'm not so much interested in language, the individual languages such as French and German and so on. But I'm interested in language as language. That is, what is it? Where did it come from? How did language begin? Those are questions which really interest me, and I do a lot of thinking about those things.
Mm-hmm. Have you studied etymologies much of your own native languages or others that interest you?
To some extent, yes. The Native American languages, of course, are not written down, so it's not possible to write in Kiowa or Apache or what have you. There are certain studies of language. Lucy Tapahansa, a friend of mine, can write in both English and Navajo, and I very much envy her that. That's a wonderful thing. But by and large, they exist in oral tradition only. And I'm interested in the oral tradition. I've taught the oral tradition for many years at the college level.
Do you remember what were some of the earliest stories that your father passed along to you, or which characters they might have incorporated?
I can remember, if not all of them, certainly most of them. Yeah. So I have those in my mind. The ones in The Way to Rainy Mountain are the most familiar to me, and I've got them. I had them even before I transcribed them. I had them very, very much in mind. You want to hear one?
Sure.
Well, I tell you a story because I'm a storyteller. I was living in San Francisco a few years ago, and I was invited to speak to a group of sixth graders at the Hebrew Academy of San Francisco. And of course I accepted because I thought, well, I'm not used to speaking to people of this age, so I wanted to know what that was like, and I went there. Didn't know what to say to them, and so I was trying to figure out what I was going to say, and I decided to tell stories. And there's one in The Way to Rainy Mountain about a talking dog. And in fact, in Kiowa, there is a formula that to indicate time way back. This happened a long time ago when dogs could talk. And so I started telling that story. It's about a man who was saved by a talking dog. And I was looking at these bright sixth graders. And so I launched into the story and I said, this happened a long time ago when dogs could talk. And the little girl in the front row looked up at me and she said, those were the days. Completely ruined the story, but anyway, it was fun. So that's my contribution.
Oh, that's hilarious. Leave it to kids.
Leave it to kids. Yeah.
I noticed there are so many animals, of course, in your work and in your traditions, and this book is no exception. So you talked about the dog. There's also the horse. What say you of the horse?
The horse is crucial to the Plains people. The Kiowas, being a Plains tribe, they were horse people. They acquired horses very early on in the 16th or 17th century, and they became equestrians. They became horse people, centaurs. You know, the Kiowa, the Plains culture is sometimes called the horse culture or the centaur culture. And the Kiowas are said to have owned more horses than any other tribe on the Plains per capita. So I became very much interested in that story, you know, the story of what the horse meant to the Kiowas. And when I moved to Jemez, I was 12 years old, and my parents gave me a horse. And I spent the next few years of my life on the back of that horse. And I'm so grateful for that because it gave me an understanding of my ancestry in a way that I would not have understood it had I not been a horse person. Mm-hmm. So that was very important to me. We can't overestimate the importance of the horse to the Plains people. It brought about a revolution in the true sense.
Absolutely. What a wonderful way for you to explore the canyons around in that area.
Yes.
What about Dragonfly? Dragonfly appears pretty prominently in Earthkeeper and in a lot of your tales.
Dragonfly was a holy man who lived at Rainy Mountain, which is the hub of the Southern Plains Kiowa world. And he would come to the house, to my grandparents' house to visit. And my father told me the story once of Dragonfly having come to the house. My dad was about 8 or 10 years old at the time. And he said that he was fascinated by this holy man, a little frightened of him and curious about him. And he said that Dragonfly was known to pray every morning outside and to bring up the sun. He prayed the sun up. And my dad said that he hid around a corner of the house before daylight. And then as the first light appeared, Dragonfly came out of the house with braids and his face was painted. And he went to a little mound on the east side of the house and he began to pray. And he prayed the sun up. And my father was, you know, he was full of awe and fear. And he told me that story. And it has since become my story because I feel that I was there. I could see Dragonfly emerge from the house. I can see him stand on this mound facing east. I can see him pray the sun out of the ground. And that's one of the great memories, blood memories of my life. I didn't actually see him, but I remember him.
And what about the bear? What about your bear spirit? Can you tell us about that?
When I was about 6 months old, living in Oklahoma at the homestead at my grandparents' house, my parents took me to Devil's Tower, Wyoming. Devil's Tower, I don't know if you know Devil's Tower. Some of you have seen pictures of it. Some of you have been there, perhaps. Others of you have seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind, so you know about this monolith. Well, it is a sacred place to the Kiowas because they encountered it when they were in the course of their migration. And they told a story about it. They didn't know what else to do, seeing this magnificent feature in the landscape. They must have been frightened and awestruck by it. So how do you deal with something like that, so completely alien to your experience? Well, they told a story about it. And the story has to do with a bear, a boy who turns into a bear and chases his sisters through the woods of the Black Hills. And as they are running for their lives, the sisters are terrified, and the bear after them. And they pass the stump of a tree, a very large tree stump. And the tree speaks to them and says, "If you will climb upon me, I will save you." So the sisters scamper on top of the tree stump, and as they do so, it begins to rise into the air. And the bear comes to kill them, but they are beyond its reach, and it rears up and scores the bark all around with its claws. And if you've seen Devil's Tower, it is deeply striated, as if some enormous animal has clawed the surface. And the story ends, the girls are beyond the bear's reach, but the story ends, the girls, the seven sisters, were born into the sky, and they became the stars of the Big Dipper. And that's the story. We know what happened to the girls. They became stars. They achieved stardom. But the boy, we don't know anything about him. He turns into a bear, and then he leaves the story. But I boy, because my name, I was named for this place, Devil's Tower, which in Kiowa was called Tsoai, rock tree. And my Indian name is Tsoai Tali, rock tree boy. And because of my name, and because of the fact that I was taken there when I was so young, I identify with the boy who turned into a bear. I am the reincarnation of that boy, and I do turn into a bear on occasion. Don't mean to frighten you, but you know, that's the story. That's my affiliation with the bear.
I want to play one more thing here from Earthkeeper. So let me do another share screen. Talk a little bit more about Scott's name and about the Earthkeeper, the idea of an Earthkeeper. So let me play this again.
The Dawn. I am an elder, and I keep the earth. When I was a boy, I first became aware of the beautiful world in which I lived. It was a world of rich colors, red canyons and blue mesas, green fields and yellow ochre sands, silver clouds and mountains that changed from black to charcoal to purple and iron. It was a world of great distances. The sky was so deep that it had no end, and the air was run through with sparkling light. It was a world in which I was wholly alive. I knew even then that it was mine, and that I would keep it forever in my heart. It was essential to my being. I touch pollen to my face. I wave cedar smoke upon my body. I am a Kiowa man. My Kiowa name is Tsoai Tali, rock tree boy. These are the words of Tsoai Tali.
Tell us a little bit more about what it means to be an Earthkeeper.
An Earthkeeper is someone who is charged with keeping the earth, with taking care of it, with being its custodian. And we live in a time when that identity is extremely important. I wrote the book, in fact, because I believe that we have come to a kind of crossroads in our civilization. We are on hard times, as I need not tell you, but part of the problem is that we have lost touch with the earth. We have lost our recognition of the spiritual aspect of the earth. The earth is possessed of spirit. It is a sacred place. And in order to save ourselves and the earth, we need to understand the spirituality of it, and we need to identify with it and protect it, give ourselves to it, invest our experience in the earth. The book, The Earthkeeper, is a small book, as you know. It's less than 100 pages in length. I think of it as a kind of prayer book, a kind of book of Psalms, if you want. It is a backpack and and satchel kind of book, briefcase kind of book. You can carry it around easily. And it makes a good companion, I think, for people who want to think and want to know something about its spiritual aspect. So I'm very pleased to have written it. I think it was a long time in coming about. It was germinating in my mind for years. So it's good to have written it, and it is one that I'm especially proud of.
It's a beautiful book. I'm so glad that I bought the audio as well, just to be able to hear your voice reading that. Did you all produce that during the pandemic, or were you able to do the audio version sometime last year? I was curious about that.
I think I did it before the pandemic, just before apparently, because it's very new. And the book was only published a few days, weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So I had to have recorded it before it was published. So I think it must have been just before the pandemic.
How are you doing upholding your tradition of being an Earthkeeper during this time when we're all sort of homebound? And what do you think about the pandemic? Do you think that it has helped people grow closer to the earth or taken us further away from it?
That's hard to say. I have, keeping the earth is a matter of the mind as well as the body. So I managed to consider myself an Earthkeeper, even though I'm quarantined. I spend more time indoors than out these days, but I still keep the earth. I keep it in my mind and heart. And that is essential, it seems to me. And I don't know about I don't know how other people view that. I think it's possible to be an Earthkeeper no matter what. The pandemic, I don't think is going to change that identity. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not, and I'm glad of that. We're going to be Earthkeepers in spite of everything, and we're going to have to be if we want the planet to survive, and ourselves with it, of course. We talk a lot about living on another planet. Oh, let's go to Mars and so on. But my attitude is, first, let's get to know the Earth. Let's get to know the planet on which we live, and the planet which has given us so much in the history of our species. We owe it something. We're deeply indebted to it. And unless we can come to terms with that, we're lost.
You've had a history on this earth now for 86 years, so you've seen a lot. What have you seen that's changed about people's ideas about earthkeeping? What is it that you think is having the most impact, maybe over time?
Modernity. The modern world has encroached upon the wilderness, so that I can remember, for example, living on the Navajo reservation, which I think is a very sacred place. When I lived there as a child, it was a different world. It was a world a world without technology, without industry. I think the Industrial Revolution brought about a critical change in the history of our species. It took us another step away from the earth. The Navajos who lived on the Navajo reservation when I was a child were deeply, deeply involved in the earth. They knew it, they celebrated it, they lived a life that we cannot imagine now. That life has been largely lost. There are remnants of it. I still like to go to Yebache dances and so on, and I'm deeply moved by the spirituality of the Navajo people. But things are changing, and we are growing, I think, farther away from the earth as time goes on. We need to come back to it, and I think that's possible. I think one of the greatest threats to us now, there are so many as it happens, but global warming, climate change is really critical. We're going to have to do something about that because we are smothering ourselves with pollution. So this book, Earthkeeper, is a way to look at the earth in another and better way, I think. And so I've seen those changes in my lifetime, and I wonder what they mean, and I'm anxious to do something about it. And so that Earthkeeper is one of my gestures in that direction.
Absolutely. You can definitely see the intent there behind the work. And I think it will inspire a lot of people to think differently about how we are stewards here. I have one more little passage I'd like to play now. I think it's very relevant to what we were just talking about. So let me share the screen again.
When I was a boy, my father took me to a place where relatives once lived. Nothing was left of the house but traces of a foundation. The place was far out on the plain, so far that mountains were in sight. My father, when he was a boy, visited the people there. At night, he said, we could hear the howls of prairie wolves. They are gone now. I would like to have seen them. Your grandfather told me that they were handsome, with long legs and beautiful yellow eyes, wild and searching. I try to see the wolves in my mind's eye, but I can only imagine them. I wish I could describe them to you. My father's voice had trailed off. Will I tell my grandchildren, I wonder, of animals they will never see?
This was one of the most profound scenes to me in the entire book for the description of it, and just the idea that things disappear. It really struck me.
Yeah, how many species disappear each year? We should be aware of that and try to preserve as much of wildlife as we can. It's sacred.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the big ideas behind the idea of earth keeping in your book too, is seeing animals for their value beyond what they mean and can do for us. A couple of the other pieces of the work in the book that really stood out to me were the passages about hunting. Could you talk to us a little bit about your relationship and what you think about hunting?
Yeah, I'm not a hunter, and I've never really been a hunter. My dad hunted, but hunting, of course, was crucial to the Plains culture in its heyday, buffalo hunting particularly. And so I have ideas about hunting. When I lived at Jemez, there were a good many hunters in the village, really good, accomplished hunters. They knew how to do it, and they would go bear hunting. Some of the men would go bear hunting, and they would bring a bear back to the village. And before it was brought into the village, the hunter paused at the edge, and the people of the village went out to welcome the bear, and they spanked it. I'm not sure what the significance of that is, but they spanked the bear, and then it was brought into the village and given away. That the cacique, the chief of the village, was given his share first, and then other people were given food from the bear. And so it was an important event, and they did it with such ceremony, and they knew what they were doing, and they observed the spiritual aspect. The bear, I'm sure, was anointed with pollen before it was brought down from the mountains. So it was a sacred activity, and one that was really at the center of earth keeping.
I want to shift gears a little bit and just talk about your poetry a little bit, because I know that you really you regard poetry highly, and you've written tons of poetry. I was reading The Death of Sitting Bear alongside listening to The Earthkeeper, which was really a fun activity because there's so much, they just interweave in and out of each other so well. So I really enjoyed doing that. In the preface of this book, You're talking about, um, I'll just read the preface. The poems in this book reflect my deep respect for and appreciation of words. I consider myself especially fortunate to have been given a rich sampling of storytelling as a child. My mother was well versed in English literature, and she taught me how to discover the wealth within books. My father, who was a Native American of the Kiowa tribe and whose first language was unwritten, told me stories from the Kiowa oral tradition. I became a poet. I believe poetry is the highest form of verbal expression. Although I have written in other forms, I find that poems are what I want and need most to read and write. They give life to my mind. Do those words still ring true for you? And
Absolutely, yes, yes. Yeah, I do think, you know, I have been a poet for many years. I started writing poetry seriously when I was an undergraduate, and I entered writing contests and won some awards and so on. So I was encouraged to write poetry. And I still consider poetry the highest form of literature. I do so because it's measured. It's, you know, my definition of poetry is a statement concerning the human condition composed in verse. And the word verse is crucial because it means measure. And traditional English poetry is measured, of course. We talk about iambic pentameter and so on. That's not true in the Indian languages. We don't have poetry as such in those languages. What we have is a highly rhythmical and economical statement that resembles poetry. And so that I have studied oral traditions, I say, for many years, and I've taught it. So I have a good idea of what it is, and I love to think about it. But poetry as such, and I went to Stanford as a creative writing fellow in poetry, and I spent 4 years there writing poetry and studying poetry. And so I have a very high regard for it. I think I know what it is finally, and I enjoy writing poetry. But I write in other things, as you mentioned in your introduction. You know, I've written plays and novels and travel literature and so on. But poetry remains the crown of literature as far as I can see.
do you write poetry every day? Or most days?
Not every day, but I would say frequently. I guess most days would be accurate. Yeah. Believe it or not, I compose poems at night in bed with the lights out. And, you know, sometimes I record them on my phone, with the ideas I have, and sometimes I don't. But I do a lot of composition in that way. I lose a lot of it, I'm sure, before I wake up, but a lot of it remains, and it's important to me.
I think that's interesting. I like to tape record myself as well with writing and notes and such. And your voice is so amazing. You have one of the greatest reading voices ever. I mean, I compare it with like James Earl Jones or something. Every time I hear your voice, I know it's you. It's just so resonant. So I love the audiobook. I encourage everyone. I know you maybe have already bought a hard copy, which is great, but you really have to at least listen to the audiobook as well. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your painting. I know that's something that you also have done, and
Yes.
it's something that you are enjoying right now.
Yes. Oh, I do enjoy it very much, and it is an expression of my spirit in the same way that writing is. My father was a painter. He was a Kiowa painter in the tradition of what is called the Kiowa Five. And these were five Kiowa artists of the 1920s and 30s who started a whole school of painting. And it has caught on. It has become that two-dimensional, very colorful, ceremonial figures kind of thing. My father painted a lot of war dancers and other things, but he was a good painter, fine one. And I learned a lot by osmosis. When I was growing up, I didn't want to become a painter at the time. I was more interested in writing. But I watched him. And long after I had become an adult, I was in the Soviet Union, in fact, teaching at the State University of Moscow. And I was very lonely there. I was isolated. There were not many people around who spoke English. And so I was lonely. And I think I wrote out of that loneliness and began drawing. And that drawing became painting, and I was able to utilize the things that I'd learned from my father. So it's an important part of my life now. By the way, let me tell you something. I thought of just a moment ago. You mentioned James Earl Jones. James Earl Jones and I have read together on occasions. I wrote a series of Bear God dialogues. And when I met James Earl Jones, I went up to him and I said, listen, would you be interested in reading with me from these Bear God dialogues? And he said, well, maybe so, you know. And I said, well, I thought, after all, you have the voice of God. And he said, oh, I thought you wanted me to be the bear. And it turns out that in his somewhere in his background, he has an animal totem, but I thought he had the voice of God. I still do.
Well, the bear would, of course, belong to you. I think that's funny. He wanted to read the bear. Oh my goodness. Okay, well, we have some people starting to put questions into the chat, into the Q&A. Please continue to do that. I want to play a couple of more things from Earthkeeper. Now we're focusing on that book. We talked a little bit before we started about the prologue and the epilogue, of course, of the book. And I found these to be very intriguing pieces. So I would like to know more about the characters within these. I'm going to play the prologue first. Let's see.
We humans have inflicted terrible wounds upon the earth. The scars are everywhere visible. Prologue. Many years ago, a young woman came to the American West in a covered wagon. I do not know her name, nor do I know the place from which she came. What I do know is this. Among the possessions she brought with her was the one thing she cherished above all others, her wedding dress. It was not the dress in which she had been married, but the dress in which someday she would be married. The personal value of such a belonging is, of course, inestimable. In the folds of the wedding dress were the woman's dreams. An unknown world opened before her, a landscape so vast and primitive that she could not comprehend it. She beheld distances that seemed endless, a range of form and color beyond her imagination. It was a world of constant change and profound mystery, incomparable beauty, and above all, wonder. I must believe that the woman's dreams were realized, that she wore her wedding dress, and that she became one with the spirit of the land. It is a story of belonging.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this character? Is she someone fictional in your mind?
I have a good friend who is a poet, and she lives in New York now, but we were at Stanford together. She told me that story about, I think it was about her great-grandmother. And it stuck in my mind, you know, here's a woman, and the catch line, it was not the dress in which she had been married, but the dress in which someday she would be married. That made a great impression on me, and I thought, this woman really did invest herself in that dress. It meant so much to her, and I think she lived up to it. I'm sure she wore it and was married in it and lived a happy life. So she's the character. She's not known to me, but one of her descendants is.
Well, you captured her well. And then a counterpart to that is the epilogue, which I won't play for folks. They can read about it in the book or hear it in the audiobook. But I love the way those two pieces really kind of bookend your work there.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got some questions coming in. I'm going to go ahead. I'll read these to you, and then we can just address the person here. Okay, Stacia, she says, how do you make peace and maintain a sense of home and connection to a place after it's changed, such as an area that was once wild and is now paved? How do you not succumb to bitterness or cynicism?
It's a good question, Stacia, and I think I know you. I think it's a matter of memory. You live in a place, and it makes such an impression upon you that you don't forget it. It does change in the course of time, or it can. And so, the homestead I knew at Rainy Mountain is no longer the homestead. It's now a collection of broken down boards and screens and so on. So it's not the same place, but that's less important than my memory of it. I can still be there in my memory, and so it still has vitality for me and a kind of sacred quality that is very important to me. And I think this happens to all of us, and it's another way of keeping the earth.
Okay, thank you, Stacia. Yeah, she is an author and a photographer herself. She lives in Corrales, just right down the road from us. She's got her own.
She's a very fine photographer and writer.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can't remember the catchy title to her book, but it's about an old woman farmer in Corrales. So thank you so much for your question. All right, let's see who's next. We've got Michael Margulies. America is said to be a turtle in some native traditions. How may reverence for our entire earth and globe as a living being, such as a turtle, help us heal in a difficult time? This is Michael Margulies from Santa Fe.
It's a matter of representation, I think. Turtle is a very wise animal and very much a creature of the earth because it spends so much of its time in the earth. And so one identifies with the earth by identifying with the creatures that represent it. And so a turtle is not a bad representative of the earth. Same for many animals, but the turtle, maybe especially to certain Indian tribes, especially, turtle is very important.
All right, here's one from Meryl from California. She used to live in New Mexico. What do you see as the role of a man of words like yourself in bridging native and non-native cultures?
Literature is a bridge. By writing, by thinking about language and the way we express ourselves in language, we can make bridges across cultures. We share the earth and realize that we have that in common, and that's very important to us. So I think that's the answer to the question. Might want to think more about it, but for the time being.
All right, here's one from Sabrina. What has been one of your favorite times in your life? Great question.
Sabrina, oh, that's a good question. I have so many times in my life that have been meaningful and enjoyable to me. It would be hard to pick out one, I think, above the others. But let me say that when I was a graduate student, when I first went to Stanford, it was a very important time for me because I was living on the Hickory Apache Reservation where I was teaching at the Dulce Independent School. And I was living in a place I loved very much because it was wild and, high in elevation, and it was just a gorgeous place. And then I won this fellowship to Stanford and went to California, never having been there before. And when I saw all of the growth and beauty and jacaranda trees and ice plant in California, I was greatly taken with the place. And I loved Stanford. I met people there who became very important in my life. And so that was a very good and enjoyable time in my life.
All right, here's one from Abby Mason. What would you say to someone who has never felt like they belonged? Not sure if that's to the earth or humanity or both. And what would you say is the difference between earth and humanity? Those are some big questions. Let's tackle the sense of belonging to someone who feels as if they've never quite belonged to earth or humanity.
I think that is sad, that losing the sense of belonging or never having had it. And I think that's a kind of common malady in our time. Um, I think fewer people really now, as compared to say 100 years ago, really have a sense of belonging. And so that's one of the things that we have lost, at least in part. And that's too bad, because it is crucial. We need to belong. We need to understand that we belong. And we need to understand that we need to understand what belongs to us as well, whether it be people or landscapes or wilderness, what have you. So good questions, yes.
Absolutely. It's really kind of the crux of this entire idea of being an earthkeeper, right?
I think so.
Yeah, we belong to each other, the earth and humanity. All right, here's one from Eric Hubbard. When stories are passed down by oral tradition, do the listeners memorize them by rote, or do the stories change from one generation to the other?
Both things happen. The oral tradition is fluid. It can be changed. Stories do change from one telling to the other, though they do, in essence, remain the same, I think, largely. But yeah, there's a good question, because I need to tell you that the oral tradition is extremely important. We all have an oral tradition, though many of us are not aware of it. We don't think about that. But we all speak to each other in our daily lives, and we construct what is essentially an oral tradition. In the oral tradition, language cannot be taken for granted. We have writing. Writing, as we know, is about 6,000 years old. And writing has given us a kind of false security where language is concerned. I can say these terrible things about writing because I'm a writer. But you can write something down on a piece of paper, and you can put it away in a desk drawer, and you can be sure that it'll be there when you come back for it, whether it be a week or a month or a year. You don't have that kind of security in the oral tradition. The oral tradition is always just one generation removed from extinction. So the storyteller must speak with great responsibility. The listener must listen with great care, and he must remember what he hears. Those three things are the marrow of oral tradition. And we need to keep that in mind, because in some ways, the oral tradition is more vital than writing. The greatest example we have of oral tradition in our time is probably theater, plays, where you go and see a production of Hamlet, say, on the stage. You have live people looking down at the audience, making eye contact, using inflection and body gestures and so on. So it's more like oral tradition than anything else in our literature, I think, at the time. And I love to think about the earliest examples of oral tradition. Beowulf, for example. Beowulf is arguably the oldest poem in the English language. And can you imagine a child living in East Anglia? One day his parents wake him up and say, come, we must go to the forest. Something is happening there. And so they take the child out. There comes this little old man into the glade, and he begins reciting Beowulf. The child is enthralled. Nothing in the world will ever be the same to him again. It is a moment of tremendous importance, and that is the value of oral tradition.
I know Beowulf is important to you. I read about your dreams in one of the books. This leads us into the next question from Debbie. What do you like to read? Do you have a regular practice that keeps you connected to the earth? Because it's so easy to be distracted these days. So what do you like to read? And then how do you stay connected to the earth?
I'm a kind of eclectic reader, I guess. I like to read different things. My eyesight is deteriorated to the extent that I can't read as much as I used to. So I listen to audiobooks like Earthkeeper. And I like mysteries. I like spy books about spies. I think Jean-Luc Carré is one of the great writers of our time, and I've pretty much read everything he's written. And I'm currently listening to Beryl Markham's, what is the title? Flight. Anyway, it's about this woman who lived in Africa and was a contemporary of Isak Dinason's, and she was a pilot. And she writes with tremendous skill and charm about her life in Africa. West with the Night, it's the name of the book. And such things interest me a great deal. And so I listen to things of that kind and enjoy them.
All right, let's see here. We've got Laura Neal. How can we encourage our children to develop connections with the earth? They are engaged with technology at a very young age, and some are not outside as much as previous generations. And yes, I will echo, as a parent, with the children doing virtual schooling, they're on their computers even more now. So how can we encourage our children to develop connections with the earth? What are your thoughts on that, Scott?
Take them out and show them the earth and point out things that fascinate them, because there's so much to be fascinated with in the earth. I had a friend who lived in Brooklyn, and he was telling me that one day his little boy went out to play, and some workers were breaking up the sidewalk. And the little boy came up and looked with fascination at what was going on. He'd never realized that there was dirt under the sidewalk. So it came as a great revelation to him, and I'm sure he appreciated finding that out. And that's what we need to do with our children. We need to help them find out things about the physical world that they might not know these days.
Absolutely. I know you mentioned earlier that you had a little garden there at your place in Santa Fe. What are some other things that you're doing to try to stay connected with the earth right now?
Writing about it. That's my principal connection with the earth now. I do enjoy getting out, and I like going into places that are not so readily visited. I like wilderness, if there is wilderness now. I think there are still vestiges. I lived in Alaska for a time, and that's a great wilderness, the last perhaps great wilderness. And just see the wildlife and that wonderful landscape of mountains and valleys and pastures, and see elk crossing snowfields and things like that. Those are some of the things that I value most.
Do you know how many states or countries you've lived in?
No, I've circumnavigated the globe, and I have lived in the Soviet Union when it was the Soviet Union. And I've been back to Siberia many times. I once, in 2008, in fact, I took the Trans-Siberian Railroad across, I think it was 9 time zones, from Moscow to Vladivostok. And this fascinating country.
Wow.
We touched upon Mongolia, and one night the train stopped, and I was awakened, and I had in my compartment, and I looked out the window, and I could see these vague yellow lights in a kind of fog, and people were walking back and forth, and we had come into Mongolia, and a young man came to my cabin, uniform, Mongolian soldier, and I gave him the papers of entry that I had filled out in advance, But as I was looking up at him, a strange thing happened to me. I thought to myself, I know this man, and I have been here before, thousands of years ago. I had returned to a place of origin. So travel has been a lot to me in my time.
All right, here's one more. This is from Claudia Sanchez. Not a question. She's just saying, she's commenting, when I first read Housemaid of Dawn many years ago in San Diego, when I was just a young woman, I had a sense of not belonging until I read your book, which gave me a voice and remembrance of my beautiful mountains, rocks, and hills of New Mexico. And the sun once again danced for me as it had in my childhood. What a lovely comment. I think that really shows us how literature can affect that sense of belonging and place for us so much when we're not able to physically be there.
Claudia, thank you for that. That was beautiful. Yes.
Abby Mason says, would you talk more about being an Earthkeeper in the mind as well as physically?
Yeah, it's primarily for me now a matter of keeping the earth in my mind. I have been over much of the earth physically, ridden over it on horseback and so on, but it is now in memory and in my mind's eye that I see the earth and understand how I might keep it at my time of life, in my age, and in the current political situation that we're in. It's a matter of thinking about it, remembering things, celebrating it in my writing, seeing it with the strength of the mind's eye now as much as anything.
All righty, there are a few more questions in the chat. I think we got cleared out of the ones in the Q&A. If anyone else has anything they'd like to ask, go ahead and either type that into the question and answer column, or you can put it in the chat. I'm looking at the chat now. There are a few questions there. One from Denise Wilcox. Scott, do you teach classes now?
Do I teach classes? Is that the question?
Yes.
I haven't in a couple of years, but when I retired from university, I came back to my alma mater of the University of New Mexico, and I have taught seminars there from time to time in recent years. I'm not doing it now, but it is something that I enjoy doing. So I do keep my hand in teaching to a degree.
Okay, let's see. Casey Citron. You have mentioned so many places you've visited and those you've been rooted in. What has been one of your greatest journeys, and what place in New Mexico is most special to you now?
Well, to answer the first part of that first, I think I would say that traveling across the breadth of Siberia was certainly an important journey for me. I've spent a lot of time in eastern Siberia, or is it western Siberia, the Ural Mountains. I've done work with my foundation, the Buffalo Trust, among the native peoples of that region. It was fascinating, and I learned about a people and a landscape that I had not known before, and it was interesting to me and important to me. And what was the last part of the question? In New Mexico.
Yes, special place here.
Oh boy, I would say Winter Rock, Arizona, Navajo Reservation. I love the Jicarilla country. I love the area. The northern New Mexico in general is very important to me. At this time of year when we're expecting snow and so on, I always think of the villages in the mountains where the old santeros live, and I can see frosted window panes with lights inside, and I can imagine pozole on the stove, and those are very wonderful ideas and dreams for me.
How are you finding living in Santa Fe? Is this the first time you've lived there?
No, I have spent many years in Santa Fe. I came here in 1948 when I was in the 8th grade, and I've been in and out ever since. And Santa Fe seems to be a place I gravitate to always, and I think of it as There are two places that I would mention, Santa Fe and Jemez Springs. Either one can claim to be the center of the world. People in Santa Fe think that Santa Fe is the center of the world, but they've not lived in Jemez Springs.
Makes sense. Jemez Springs is beautiful. It's one of my
Yeah.
favorite places of New Mexico.
It is lovely, yes.
All right. Well, I think we're wrapping this up now, Scott. It looks like we've attended to everyone's questions. We've talked about the book. They got to hear your beautiful voice. You've given us some stories tonight. Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it so much. This is just such a golden opportunity for all of us to be able to hear about your new book and to see you on the computer screen.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it immensely.